This video is going to cover Chapter 1, Section 2. We're going to focus on the goal of describing key data collection methods. So, the book focuses on these 4 data collection procedures, the way that we get data from people or things, whatever the thing is that we're trying to study. It focuses on these 4 because these are the 4 things that we actually use mostly in business and economics to get the information that we need. So you see experiments, you might think science, but we do those in business and economics some. We've got telephone surveys, written questionnaires, direct observation, and personal interview. So let's start by explaining some of these things, and I'll try to give you some examples to make this make sense. So an experiment actually is any kind of thing that we do that's going to give us an outcome, and the outcome is uncertain. So when you perform an experiment, you know how to do this in the science lab, you perform an experiment, you don't know exactly what's going to happen, but you try it and you record the data. Well, we do the same thing in business. So for example, pretend that you ran a nightclub and you're trying to figure out how to increase the business on a Saturday night. So you decide to run a karaoke night. What the heck, right? So you run a bunch of flyers and you say maybe a prize for the best singer, and you have a karaoke night. You're experimenting to see the impact on the attendance at your bar on a Saturday night. That would get people in the door, maybe, maybe not. That's uncertain, so it's an experiment. Direct observation is actually us physically observing something and recording what takes place in the process. So a lot of times you think about people watching what's going on in business, so we see how a customer responds to a particular item. I always think about the psychological studies when they put a big bowl of Oreos in the room and try to see how people respond, and then they process that in a way that would be direct observation. Now, this can be subjective, and it can also be time consuming because we have to have some labor in there actually viewing what's going on. And it can be subjective because we're not sure if you would interpret it the same way that I would interpret a person's behavior. Direct observation, though, also includes the day-to-day recording of what's going on in the business. So you might not actually realize it, but businesses are collecting information pretty much the entire time that they're open on a given day. When they take that item from you and they scan it across the scanner, the UPC code rings in, that's being recorded in a computer somewhere, and they're actively collecting data. We can also engage in personal interviews. So we sit you down and we ask you questions about what you think. Oftentimes those are structured interviews. So we have questions laid out, we know what we're going to ask, and we ask only those questions, and we ask them in a very particular way. So you might have been on the phone with somebody before, I'm interviewing you for a particular thing, and they say, no, I have to read the question in its entirety. That's a structured interview. They have to do it in a very particular way. They have to read those questions very carefully to you. Unstructured interviews are a little bit different, and actually more probably like a job interview. That if you've been on a job interview, they know that they have a few big questions that they want to ask you. But then they might ask you follow-up questions based on your responses. So that would be an unstructured interview. There's, of course, surveys and questionnaires, and those are probably the things that you're most familiar with. And you'll probably, before the end of this chapter, have a chance to design a little bit of a questionnaire. Maybe we'll get thinking about some things that we might ask around campus or something. Surveys and questionnaires are made up of 3 types of questions. There are close-end questions. Those are questions that require the person to pick from a small list of choices. So, for example, I could say, a close-end question for this class, are you a business major? Are you an econ major? Or are you some other kind of major? That would be a close-ended question, and you just check by 1 or 2 or 3 of those boxes, depending on what applied to you. Open-ended questions allow a person to say whatever they want to say. So they can write down anything that they want to write down. An open-ended question could be something like, how do you like this class so far? That gives you the opportunity to say anything you want. So those are open-ended and close-ended questions. Now, there's a trade-off between using those 2 kinds of questions. Close-ended questions allow us to really easily see the response, compile it in a spreadsheet, and calculate a number or create a graph from it. But it doesn't give us a lot of information. An open-ended question is much harder to quantify, to put in a spreadsheet. But that open-ended question allows us to get really deep into what somebody thinks if the person really responds well. Of course, you know about demographic questions. Those are things that tell us about your characteristics, those kinds of things. So if we have a demographic question for a survey in this class, I could ask something like freshman, sophomore, junior, senior. So that demographic question will give me some idea of your characteristics. Now, there's about 6 major steps that we follow when we do any kind of written survey or phone survey. So the book kind of separates this out like it's 2 separate things. It's really the same thing. No matter what we do here, we're going to define the issue. What is it that we want to know from these people that we're going to try to talk to? We have to define the population of interest. So we have to say, okay, who are we going to talk to about this? So let's say, for example, we were interested in knowing how people on campus felt about the cafeteria food. Well, we could define the issue. We want to know if people are satisfied with the cafeteria food. Define the population of interest. So that could be a couple of different things here. We could be interested in how everybody on campus feels about that food. But notice, we're still talking about only people on campus, so students, staff, and faculty alike. Or we could be saying, well, we're really only concerned about what the students think about this because they're a bit more of a captive audience, and so we want to try to respond to their needs more than the staff and faculty's needs. So we'd have to define that population of interest. Then we'd write up the questions. Some close-ended, some open-ended, maybe some demographic questions depending on what it is we were trying to find out. You often will pre-test the survey. All that means is find a small group of people, get them to answer the survey, and see how they respond. You can find out very quickly, as I have done in my own research, that you write questions that you understand, and you think a particular kind of answer will come to that question, and things are very, very different from that. So pre-testing the survey really gives you an idea of how well you've written the survey. Then you're going to figure out the sample size, which really is just how many people are we going to try to collect this information from. The sampling method, which we'll talk about in a minute, but that's really just how do we pick those people from the entire population, because we're certainly not going to be able to get everybody to respond to the survey. The last step is actually just going ahead and picking that sample and getting people to take that instrument. We call it an instrument. The survey questionnaire, that's an instrument, and we administer that instrument. We get people to take that survey or questionnaire. Okay, so there are trade-offs. We use different kinds of data collection techniques for different kinds of things, for different kinds of reasons. So you can see the trade-offs as you start to look across here, advantages and disadvantages here, right? So you can take a second to kind of look at that. I want to talk about a couple of important things that I think people often don't think about when they're looking at this. I often hear students say, well, I wouldn't send out questionnaires in the mail because postage is really, really expensive. Actually, mailing questionnaires out, and now with internet, emailing questionnaires out is really, really inexpensive. But there is a problem. You put a questionnaire in the mail, you put a link in somebody's inbox, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to respond. So even though they're really, really inexpensive, they're often a relatively low response rate. Oftentimes I'll hear students say, well, a telephone survey would be better. Okay, telephone surveys might be better. They're not as inexpensive, though, as mailing out questionnaires. And students will often say, why? It doesn't take that much to pick up the telephone and call somebody. But you have to pay the labor that's going to make those telephone calls. And people don't like to talk to people on the phone who are calling them at dinner time to take a survey. So there are trade-offs when we consider what we're going to use to do this. Then you might say, well, then we should just have direct observation of everything. But again, you're thinking about those labor costs, right? So you always have to think about all the costs associated with a particular instrument when you choose to use it. Experiments can also be difficult because sometimes we can't experiment on things. So when I used to teach Econ 200, I would say, hey, we should call up the chair of the Federal Reserve and say, hey, why don't you double the interest rate? Let's see what happens. We couldn't do that. That would be really, really dangerous to our economy. So experiments are not always possible. Okay, when we collect data, we really have to worry about something called bias. And I'm not going to go through each of these things in turn. I will allow you to read those and ask questions if you have questions about them in class. But bias is a big problem. What it means is our data set does not accurately represent the population. So anything we say from that data set probably does not accurately represent what we wanted to know about the population. Now, not all data has bias, but we have to be concerned about that and make sure that we account for that when we're actually doing our data collection. Measurement error is another thing that can cause bias. The book uses an example of measurement error where they had two different workers measuring the thickness of boards using a caliper, and we got very, very different numbers. Well, we want to be careful about measurement and make sure that we're trying to collect the data in a very consistent kind of way. The goal is to collect data that's accurate and reliable so that when we use the data to say something about the population, it really says something about the population. Do you always know that there's a problem with your data? No. And so that's part of why I say statistics is really an art.